Good evening. Welcome to this pre-concert talk. I'm so happy to see all of you, and I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Keller and McLeod, the law firm, for sponsoring so graciously the entire season of pre-concert talks. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you. Our guest for tonight will be Teddy Abrams, so I'd like to invite him to the stage. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a seat. So I know Teddy from Detroit, where he used to be assistant conductor to Leonard Slotkin. And then all of a sudden he became a music director in Louisville, and I thought he was one of the fastest rising stars in the conducting world. And besides that, he's also a composer, and he plays clarinet and piano amazingly. So welcome to the stage, and my first question to you is, how does it feel for you to be a music director? Is the first time you got this kind of a job?
Yeah, it's wonderful. It's actually a very different job than the assistant conductor role, although being in Detroit as assistant conductor was one of the most interesting places I think that I could possibly have been, because, well, I'm sure, as you know, there's a lot of interesting and varied things going on in Detroit, and it's a city that does that actually has incredible challenges, but is facing them with really remarkable results and really interesting answers. And I think the orchestra there was actually leading that charge. So I was a part of an orchestra that was very exciting at a really interesting time, a really creative time there, and I got to be a part of that energy for 2 years. But now that I'm a music director, it basically means that already the balance of actual conducting to the balance of talking was pretty lopsided. About, I would say before it was like 75% talking, 25% conducting. Now it's 95% talking and 5% conducting. And it means that a lot of what I do ends up being either psychological or political. I mean, it's all these other things that go into making a sustainable and creative and interesting arts organization that actually the conductor ends up doing, or the music director ends up doing, I should say. Because it's all about getting to that point when you actually can conduct. I mean, when you're making the music, then you're doing what everybody believes in and dreams about. But because of the complexities of these organizations, it means that you spend so much of your time trying to create the positive environment to make that possible. And so as a music director, I see my role as extremely varied. Of course, what I love to do is make music, whether it's composing or performing. But I understand that to do that requires development and marketing and branding and strategy and all the things that go into essentially making that happen, which mostly involves communicating with people. That's actually a kind of a new idea in our world here, our arts organization world. It used to be that conductors would just conduct and that was it. And that has changed dramatically recently, or at least it should, because who better to advocate for the music than the musicians themselves? And that should be led by example as far as I'm concerned. So that's why I do it.
Great. Thank you so much for that answer. As you know,
it's like a debate. Do we have somebody to rebut that?
Well, I asked that question on purpose because we don't have a music director, and probably the most frequent questions that we get asked is, when are you going to have one? And my answer to that is that we're always looking for the silver bullet, for the right match. And the reality is, as we go forward, we are going to formalize a process that will, bring some finalists over here, and then hopefully the audiences will participate in kind of giving us feedback about what they like. But it's good for everybody to know what it goes on that, because evidently a lot of what you do as a music director is in the shadow. It doesn't really come to the audience, but the programming is something that comes to the audience, and they notice from season to season. So how do you go about programming for your orchestra in Louisville?
Well, that's a great question. And yeah, programming is probably the single most important component of what a conductor does, or especially what a music director does, because it's kind of like this: if you were a chef, like an executive chef, and you were responsible in a period of time for going to the market and pretty much choosing every ingredient for every single recipe on every menu that people are going to eat for an entire year. And that means not only what people are going to eat, but what the chefs and the cooks are actually going to be producing. And that is a huge task, because it means that you're setting essentially a nutritional course, as I say, uh, both for what people want and what people need for an entire year. So it's an immense undertaking because once you program that, it's really like a course of action or a plan or a map. You go on that path. I mean, you're not really going to stray from it. You can't say, oh, you know, next week actually Mahler 5, not quite the right thing to do right now. We're going to switch to the Goretzky Third Symphony. It doesn't work that way. So it means that you really have to think about not only the individual program, but the entire kind of diet of what the community is going to be absorbing and understanding. That music, the choice of repertoire, is how people, it's the lens through which people are going to perceive and understand your organization. And so every program has to be cohesive and tell a story. What I try and do is make sure that each program, whether it's a subscription concert or a kids concert, because I love doing those, so I do all those in Louisville also. But each one has something that if you were to see somebody on the street that had never been to the orchestra before, in 10 to 20 seconds, could get them to come by telling them a story about what that program is. Doesn't mean that the piece has to actually tell a story. It just means that there needs to be a compelling, marketable idea or a compelling a kind of thought behind the program. In other words, it's not just choosing your favorite pieces. For me, it's really about creating a balanced program that has something extremely viable and sellable even. And then it also means throughout the course of a season, what are people going to experience? What's the art going to be? And behind the scenes, it's also what does the orchestra need? Because orchestras are living, breathing, and growing organizations. And believe it or not, the choice of repertoire actually greatly influences the way that they play. And there's a huge difference between approaching repertoire like Mozart and repertoire like Debussy. And orchestras are all good at doing different things. And if you want to improve an orchestra, you have to choose the right repertoire that's going to allow that to be achieved. And that's something that's really tough to do because, of course, if you know an orchestra's strengths, you can't just program things that are not to their strengths, hoping that it will make them better at that. You have to incorporate that very, very thoughtfully to improve these things. And a lot of audiences wonder, well, we can't even hear that. We can't hear that kind of thing on that level. And I actually say that's not true. What a lot of audiences, especially in America where music education is varied, I won't say that it's bad, it's varied. Audiences might not be able to articulate those things. They might not be able to say, oh, that was, you know, your second trumpet who's, you know, consistently, you know, playing flat, or it just seems like, you know, the back of the viola sections needs X, Y, or Z. Most people won't articulate it in as many words, but they sense it and they perceive it. And I firmly believe in that. Like that has to be one of the core of my beliefs, because otherwise, I mean, what's the point of even rehearsing anything? And I believe so strongly that while audiences cannot necessarily say the specific words that describe something, they know. And that's why when they see a concert played by like the Berlin Philharmonic and they see the musicians moving around and there's this incredible energy to the sound, people respond to that, although they might not necessarily say it was because, wow, that E-flat clarinet player just, you know, played incredibly in tune on the high D. That's not what people say, even though that might have happened. And so I take the programming extremely seriously. And I had a wonderful mentor. I actually had two fantastic conducting bosses. The first was the person that I grew up studying with. His name is Michael Tilson Thomas, and he is the music director of the San Francisco Symphony. And I started working with him from a very early age, and then in Detroit with Leonard Slatkin. And Tilson Thomas always said something that I loved, that a program has to have three components. And this is for the audiences and the orchestra. It has to have something that in some way is challenging. That when you go to the performance, you are challenged as a human being understanding this art. That it forces you to think or to grow, or maybe it questions elements of what you might have considered this music or even the performance to be. It has to have something that's exciting, something that gets you really going, that really is something that shows that the music itself has an energy to it, that has this kind of kinetic power. And then number three, it has to have something reaffirming, some part of the program that for maybe a single chord or a whole piece, you say to yourself, that's why orchestras are around. I mean, that's why they exist in the first place. Doesn't mean you have to have 3 pieces, each with one of those things. That's just the balance of like salty to sweet to sour. And you have to have those 3 things on any program so that I think audiences not only feel like they've gotten the growing experience that we all should go through, but also the reaffirming one that makes you want to come back. So,
Wonderful. What about your composition these days? Do you have time to sit back somewhere and compose from time to time?
well, I don't have time to do it, but I do it anyway. Um, I realized one thing: the big difference with the music director role is that I don't really have much say over the schedule. They just kind of fill up things to do, and that takes up a lot of time. But uh, I think that if you don't find a true creative outlet, all the cheerleading and fundraising in the world is wonderful, but that's not the same thing as sitting down at a piano and just imagining music, which is such a core part, I think, of the creative experience. And if you don't make time for that and you don't set that as a priority, it's very easy for words to become hollow. And so I've made it a point, whether there's time or not, to write things. Actually, I found the best way to do it is just to put on a program in the future a piece that hasn't been written yet. Then you have literally no choice, and you have to do it. And it doesn't matter if it's at 2 in the morning, but it gets done. And so actually, one of the things I love to do is improvise, and not just in the context of jazz, although I play jazz and bluegrass and a bunch of styles that involve improv as solos, but improvise whole pieces. And I found that actually this is historically something that most so-called classical composers did all the time. In fact, the majority of music that was produced by people like Mozart and Beethoven was probably improvised, the ratio of how much they improvised to what they actually wrote down. And the fact of the matter is it's much faster to improvise a piece of music, and with technology, you can actually capture it now. So sadly, we'll never know what Mozart's hundreds of improvisations per year would have sounded like. We'll never know, but they must have been magnificent. We have some records of what they sounded like, but we'll never hear it. So now, though, we can capture that, and it is possible to improvise in a way that a piece sounds complete, not just like you're, kind of screwing around on the piano, which is, something that is a skill that has not been encouraged in mainstream music education for a long time, and I'm trying to bring back as much as possible. So. But yeah, I know next year I'm writing a ballet, for instance, so and a bunch of pieces that are like I wrote a kind of album worth of stuff that might be a little more in the singer-songwriter direction, except I don't sing, so I have to find somebody else
to
do.
Anyway.
No, you trust me. That's one thing we'll never add to the list.
Well,
Except in rehearsals. If you hear rehearsals, I sing all the time, but just to make a point.
so you could have been a professional pianist, or even I assume a professional clarinet player. Yet you chose to be a conductor, and I assume it was early in your career. If you're talking about working with the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony, when was that, and what made you decide to go in this direction?
It was actually a very specific instance. I was 9 years old, and I was at a free outdoor concert that the San Francisco Symphony played. And I had been playing the piano, and I enjoyed it, and would improvise, actually, and play it all the time. I'd taken up the clarinet when I was 8, and also really taken to that instrument for some reason. I can't explain that, but whereas the piano, I was not, especially proficient. There are little kids who are playing the, Rachmaninoff Third Concerto when they're 6 years old. I was not like that. But on the clarinet, for whatever reason, it was just completely natural to me. And I think my parents recognized that. Certainly my teachers and the band folks recognized that. It was just it was a little freakish. And so my mom thought I should see an actual orchestra concert. It's kind of amazing because sometimes I conduct concerts for kindergartners or first graders, and I tell them, you are so lucky, I didn't even get to see a real concert until I was in 4th grade. And I went to this free outdoor concert. I'll never forget, it was all Gershwin. And pretty much from the first 2 or 3 minutes of the program, I decided that I wanted to be a conductor. And it was not just kind of like wanting to be an astronaut, or that might be a cool thing one day. I decided, I was going to do that. And so I wrote this long letter to Tilson Thomas, who's the music director of the San Francisco Symphony, page after page after page of crazy person letter, basically. Fortunately, it was by a 9-year-old, and I think I indicated that at some point, so he didn't throw it out. And in fact, he wrote me back just a couple of days later, and I had asked for conducting lessons. I'd asked for a lot of things, and he very wisely steered me in the right direction. Um, and actually, a couple of years later, I ended up studying conducting, and he gave me some of my first opportunities. I was very fortunate to either find or connect with people that were willing to take a crazy risk on a kid and let me actually conduct. A lot of times in conducting education these days, they don't let you conduct until you're way too old to, I think, learn it. And it's a physical skill. Much like driving, even though I will say, full disclaimer, I don't have a driver's license. I've refused to learn to drive. But I would imagine very much that if you're sitting in the passenger seat of a car, I grew up in the Bay Area, so it's like then I lived in Detroit, so we didn't talk about that too much there. But if you're sitting in the passenger seat of the car, watching the driver, that's not the same thing as learning to drive. And that's how they teach conducting at most universities and most high-level conducting programs. You sit and you observe a lot of things and maybe conduct a piano here and there. And these are people in their mid, even late 20s. So I was very lucky that when I was even 11, 12, 13, I was having opportunities to conduct, because it makes a big difference. So, and I love it. And on the other hand, I will say this, that the reason I continue to play is because whenever you're conducting, you are working with human beings, you are working with instrumentalists who are performing a physical task. And no matter how intellectual or emotional you want to get about the music, you have to remember that everything you say or do is going to be translated to a physical act of playing music. And I think a lot of times if you are a conductor and you forget that, or you've become so distanced from what it's like to actually produce music, that you stop remembering of that connection and that incredible challenge of producing sound. And you stop, I think, remembering the kind of wonder and the magic that is whatever happens between you and the instrumentalists. So that's one of the reasons I continue to play. In addition to liking it, you have to be tethered to that. And all the historical conductors of the past would have done the same thing. It's only a recent phenomenon that some conductors don't play at all, which shocks me.
It
Yes.
shocks
I
me
hope
too.
none of them are here.
Some of them, they
You
don't
have to
even
play with
conduct,
them.
you know.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
But thank you very much for that. Would you be so kind and share some insights that you have about tonight's repertoire? Of course, we have the program notes that everybody has access to, but maybe there's some personal things that you discovered in those pieces that you might want to share with our audience.
Absolutely. Well, this is such a good program. I mean, I must say, and Marian suggested it, actually because I was doing Lambert with the Detroit Symphony last year, and I was thinking to myself, so many of the programs that I do these days involve some crazy element where the piece is not written yet, or there's some giant project or a collaboration or a light show or something. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, it's really nice. We're doing Debussy and Grieg and Strauss, and it was just sometimes fun to play great music that is not with a wild and dangerous component to it. But of course, all three of these pieces are standards, are incredibly like audience favorite type pieces. They're pieces that just naturally work out of the box. I will say about the Strauss Don Juan, which is really not only just a remarkable piece in and of itself, but historically very important. It's, of course, a tone poem, which is a kind of piece that describes something, whether it's poetry or literature or a single painting. It could be anything. But Strauss had a way of, in music, portraying things so vividly and clearly that I think audiences were often shocked by how, in this case, cinematic the music could be. And for composers like Strauss who were writing this, of course, before there was film music, this became kind of the source, I think, of a lot of the ways that composers who, let's face it, film composers are the ones who interface with the most people, drew their inspiration from. And it is because the music describes action, and the music describes setting and character with a kind of alarming detail. But it's an interesting thing. I think about this a lot. There was a great Leonard Bernstein Young People's concert that is called What Does Music Mean? And the whole time, Bernstein discusses whether or not music has any intrinsic meaning. So Bernstein will play a piece of music, tell the kids, he says, well, I want to play this piece, it's about cowboys, and they play the piece. So you heard the cowboys, right? So, oh, actually, no, I messed up. It's actually about space aliens. He plays it again. And they'll go, oh, yeah, we heard the space aliens. It's like, actually, that D major chord doesn't mean anything at all. That D major chord just works because that's the kind of abstract language of music. And I keep thinking about this as I do a piece like Don Juan, which of course tells the story of, in this case, Lanau's Don Juan, unlike Lord Byron's more farcical Don Juan. But this tells the story of the swashbuckling, extremely confident man who eventually, meets his demise. And so I wondered to myself, as cinematic and as brilliant in terms of storytelling this piece actually is, do you need to know that? Is this something anybody needs to know? And I actually say you don't. If you came to this concert, you knew nothing about Don Juan whatsoever. The music is so vivid, whether or not you knew it was Don Juan, whether or not you knew the story, you would still find the inherent kind of language making sense to you. And I think that's a really important part of the way music works for me to recognize that great music like this, although it might be enhanced by a backstory, it might be enhanced by knowing something about Richard Strauss, it's not necessary to know that in order to find really intense enjoyment from it. However, I do recommend letting your imagination run wild in this piece, just because it is so extraordinary and it is so vivid. And the other thing I will say is that this is kind of an insider element, but the very first page of Don Juan for the string players is asked on almost every single audition ever. It's one of the best known individual orchestral works. Every violinist on the planet has practiced the first page of Don Juan. And so it doesn't seem to matter what orchestra you go to, the way it starts, it starts with the smallest little rest of music, meaning that there's a little indication that says you rest for about, an eighth of a second, and then you play really, really fast. And I could go to pretty much any orchestra, just put my arm up and go down, and the orchestra will play that, at least the first page, perfectly well. And I find that that's insider information. So for the people that are here tonight at the lecture, you can turn to them and say, this is an audition piece. And I'm sure they'll, oh, wow. So anyway, there's that. Well, I don't know how much time there is to talk about anything else.
We have a few more minutes. Maybe
you want to do some questions?
We could do some questions. We have 6 minutes, so I assume we're going to be able to do 2 questions maybe. And I see a hand there and a hand here. Why don't we start with the gentleman there? Repeat it to the audience.
I will repeat the question, which is
repeating the question.
Asking whether I had any say in the program itself, and then whether or not, let's say I didn't have say in the program, if I thought that the program wasn't particularly good, being honest, but I came anyway because I just wanted to come see the New Mexico Philharmonic. And we did talk about the program for sure, and I think it was because I was conducting the Debussy La Mer at the Detroit Symphony that Marion suggested that I come here and play that with New Mexico. And honestly, if you suggest these 3 pieces, I'm never going to say no to them because they're so solid. They work so well together. And yes, while it doesn't have a crazy collaborative cross-platform, multi-genre element, which is fun, this is all great music, and I mean, I would never say no to conducting any of these pieces, and so that's
maybe I can explain a little bit of the process. So we do offer a lot of the pieces to on our program, which I don't think we had a bad program, to be honest, and that I'm sure you noticed that, right? But we offer the programs that we discuss with the orchestra. There's an artistic task force, and we talk about programs for the next season. We offer it to the conductors, and many times they say, well, I like this, but I like to do this instead. And that might have to do with a piece that they perhaps studied recently or performed recently, or they might think that it fits better with other program. So that happens from time to time. In this case, it didn't, because most of the pieces that we programmed, they're pieces that I knew he conducted, and I actually performed in the orchestra with Teddy when that happened. Thank you very much for a great question. If you want to repeat that.
Yeah. So that's a great question. I'm on the spot to identify what's challenging, exciting, and reaffirming about this concert. And I would say, well, one of the great things about it is every one of these pieces will have something reaffirming, which is really good. One of the great things about the outer 2 pieces, Don Juan and La Mer, are that no matter how many times you've played these 2, they are never easy. They're never easy for the musicians, And I think they're never just easy listening pieces for the audiences. That's one of the great things about them. There are definitely pieces in the classical canon, in the orchestral canon, that with great repetition become almost old hat, something you could pull out any time. In fact, I remember seeing a concert of the Cleveland Orchestra, and the conductor had gotten sick. They had to get somebody at the last minute, and that conductor didn't know the piece they were supposed to be playing, which was something obscure, and so they switched to Brahms 2. They hadn't played Brahms 2 in a long time, but the Brahms Second Symphony, they could pull that out. It was a beautiful concert. They played it musically and interestingly. You couldn't do that with La Mer. You can't do that with La Mer because of the intricacy, because of the delicacy of the orchestration and the lines of music that we call counterpoint. That's when they're all played at the same time, all these different lines. It requires a finesse and an intensely worked out performance to make it interesting. And also the language of La Mer, despite it being a very, very famous piece, is not what you might call easy listening language. It's a highly advanced form of harmony. It's a highly advanced form of just kind of like sonic creation. It's not meant to be something that you can relax to and just listen to as if it's nice. This is music that's meant to challenge. But of course, it's also very exciting. I mean, there's no way you can hear, despite the challenge of playing the beginning of Don Juan, for instance, or the end, say, of the third movement of La Mer, despite the challenge of playing that, there's also no way you can listen to that and not say, oh my gosh, the only time I can hear sounds like this are here at an orchestra concert. The only way you can experience it to its fullest is when it's live. So right there, you have the reaffirming, you have the challenging, and of course you have the very exciting. So, and not to mention the Grieg, which is entirely not only exciting but reaffirming, because to watch a pianist like Olga Kern play this piece so brilliantly and it's very virtuosic, that's excitement defined. But of course, the melodies in this are some of the most well known in the orchestral music repertoire. So, it's got that element of it too.
So I'm happy that we have all those three elements for you tonight. I hope you'll enjoy them. And thank you very much for being here once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.